We're just a few kilometers away from Israel's border with Gaza, where Hamas burst through and carried out the October 7th terror attacks. These Israeli families are gathering here because they want to go and live in Gaza, which they sometimes call Gush Katif, even as war continues to bring death and destruction to Palestinians in the Strip. Their signs read, "Only settlements will bring security, and conquering, settling, winning."
You look in the Torah and you see, very simple, the answer there, that Israel belongs to the Jews and Gaza is Israel. Doesn't mean that you're not allowed to live here if you're not Jewish, no. But at the same time, it belongs to the Jews.
The plan this evening was to drive along the border with Gaza, a symbolic return. But heavy rain forced organizers to move everyone indoors. One of those organizers is Daniella Weiss.
בני אדם נורמליים, בדרך כלל דוחים אירוע כאשר יש גלגל כזה.
The 78-year-old has been involved in establishing settlements in the Israeli-occupied West Bank for decades. These settlements often displace Palestinians and are illegal under international law. She's been arrested numerous times, but sees her unofficial approach as more efficient than anything parliamentarians could do.
No member of Knesset can do what I do. No member. People look for purpose. And what I give them is the love of our homeland. And this is why they will follow me everywhere.
Now Weiss says she's using her pressure group Nachala to work towards settling Gaza. And she says it's a realistic aim.
We publicized the fact that Nachala movement is organizing groups of families to settle the entire area of Gaza. And people registered, hundreds of families. The Arabs of Gaza will not stay in Gaza, period.
This rally may seem small, but it has outsized connections. Their demands have been echoed by two far-right ministers in Benjamin Netanyahu's government. One of them is Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, often described as an ally of Weiss. They live in the same occupied West Bank settlement. The other is National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who recently called for a return to Gush Katif, the main block of Israeli settlements that once existed in the Gaza Strip. The defense minister disagrees, and Netanyahu says a return to Gush Katif is unrealistic. But his government has not laid out an official plan for Gaza's future. Noga Tarnopolsky is an independent journalist who's been covering Netanyahu for most of her career. She says even though the Prime Minister has given Ben-Gvir and Smotrich unprecedented power, resettling Gaza is different.
You can't just occupy territory because the Prime Minister wants to. It has to be an entire cabinet decision, has to be voted on in Parliament. He hasn't said a word to them because he needs them in order to stay in power. But what we see is that he lets them keep talking about it. He lets them make this be a subject in the public space, even when this causes Israel measurable and significant harm on the global stage.
That harm? Condemnation from Israel's top allies, the US and Germany. Egypt and Jordan, which have long-standing relations and peace treaties with Israel, have ruled out resettling Palestinians on their territory. And for Palestinians themselves, Israeli discussions about uprooting them from their homes brings back memories of 1948, when over 700,000 were forced to flee in the war fought over Israel's establishment. Despite international resistance to a return of Israeli settlements in Gaza, Noga Tarnopolsky says the ministers pushing the idea shouldn't be ignored.
I think we're talking about maybe a few thousand people who are fringe figures led by opportunistic, marginal extremists who think that they can take advantage of this moment. I think it's important to cover them because they do have power right now, because they're sitting in government.
And yet, fringe ideas discussed by demonstrators here in a basement can also be found in wider society. A survey conducted by the Hebrew University found 33% of respondents in favor of annexing and resettling Gaza. Another one by Israeli Channel 12 showed 44% of respondents in favor of reestablishing settlements in the Strip. That survey found the figure jumped to 66% among Netanyahu's supporters. Calls for a Jewish return to Gaza or Gush Katif are not new in Israel, but they have been getting louder since the October 7th attacks. To understand the thinking behind these calls, we have to look at Israel's recent history in the Gaza Strip, a history laid out here at the Gush Katif Museum in Jerusalem. In 1967, at the end of the Six-Day War, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip and other territories. Almost 400,000 Palestinians lived there, over half of whom were refugees from elsewhere. Soon, Israelis started building settlements, the largest block of which was called Gush Katif. It was against international law to be there, but museum guide Avner Franklin believes the settlers made a positive impact.
They turned the place from a desert into a Garden of Eden. This was a picture taken about 10 or 15 years later of the same place. So you can see what
Gazans felt otherwise, and violence in the Strip escalated. It became unsustainable for Israel to keep the settlers there. In 2004, the Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, decided to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza and evacuate the more than 8,000 settlers living there. The decision divided Israeli society, for and against. Resistance to the evacuation culminated in 2005 with scenes like these. Israeli police officers and soldiers forcibly removing settlers from their homes. Datya Itzhaki lived in Gush Katif for 21 years.
It was a completely betrayal. Ariel Sharon, he came many times and he said he would go down to Rafiach Yam, to the border with Egypt, and say the only way to protect the south of Israel is having the civilians in Gush Katif. It was crime against the security of the state of Israel, against values of Zionism, and against the people that were there.
But leaving Gaza did not usher in an era of calm. Almost as soon as the settlers were gone, Hamas in Gaza intensified rocket attacks on Israel. Israel continued to control access to the territory, and life for civilians there kept getting worse. The next almost 2 decades were marked by wars and conflict that culminated in the terror of October 7th, 2023. It was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. Almost 1,200 people were killed, 4,834 injured, and over 200 were kidnapped and taken to Gaza. The communities hardest hit were the kibbutzim right next to Gaza.
The community was Rafiach Yam.
Datya says left-wing people living there had strongly believed that the 2005 disengagement would bring peace.
So the Arabs were cheering when they took us into the buses, and then when the buses went out, the kibbutzim were standing there and cheering. And they were very happy when they took us out from the Gaza region, and we told them, you'll pay the price. And you know, I'm not happy I was right.
Datya wants to return to where her house in Gaza once stood, and thinks others should join her. The Palestinians who live there are not her concern.
We give a solution to the Israelis that today have to flee from their homes because of the war. Egypt can give a solution to the people from Gaza that flee from their homes because of the war. You know, give them a solution. They're our enemy. I can't give them a solution.
Here in Israel's parliament, the Knesset, some representatives agree that having Israeli civilian and military presence in Gaza had kept a lid on violence, and that a return would increase security. Ohad Tal is a Knesset member from Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich's ultra-nationalist party, Religious Zionism.
We have to make sure that these things will not happen again, so we have to control the area. And again, in order to control the area, we have to have the Israeli civic presence in these areas.
He's himself a settler living in the occupied West Bank, which he refers to with its biblical name, Judea and Samaria. Why do civilians have to be there and live in sometimes very dangerous for them environments when the state should be the one securing borders?
Israel is a beacon of peace and democracy in the Middle East. It's true. We decided to live in this region, which is, we have many neighbors who does not want us to be here.
I'm talking about Gaza specifically.
But,
if you put civilians there,
that's the same thing. I live in Efrat. It's the same. I'm threatened by Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, in Arab cities of the Palestinian Authority each and every day. Why they don't have the same capabilities like Hamas? Just because of one thing, because Israel have the security control of the area and have the civic presence with settlements, with Jewish villages in Judea and Samaria, which are protecting Tel Aviv, which are protecting Kfar Saba and all the cities, the Israeli cities. We have to do the same thing in Gaza.
the UN says settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank has reached unprecedented levels since October 7th. The Palestinian Authority, which governs parts of the occupied West Bank, recognizes the state of Israel, unlike Hamas in Gaza, which, like Iran and Lebanon, doesn't. Ohad says settlements on Palestinian territory would send a message to the whole region.
To all the enemies that we're having in this neighborhood, telling them that if you're killing Israelis, if you're killing babies, if you're raping women, you will pay price that you consider as something that is for you a heavy price.
And that's land.
And that's land. The only price is land. Now, I think the world also should support humanitarian evacuation of Palestinians from Gaza because it's for their own good.
But
I think it's a win-win.
When Palestinians hear that, they think permanent displacement. They don't think evacuation. They think that they're being kicked out of their land.
So I offer something very simple. Let's just open the borders and we'll see who wants to stay and who wants to leave.
Back at the museum, which was founded by a right-wing group involved in the campaign to remain in Gaza, interest in Gush Katif's past and a possible revival is growing. Tours are booked for months in advance, Avner tells me. And t-shirts like these are high in demand.
It says, Habaita chozrim leGush Katif. Let's go home, we're going back to Gush Katif. And people want to buy this today. There's been a tremendous interest.
This menorah once stood in a synagogue in Gaza. This past Hanukkah, the museum arranged for it to be taken back to Gaza for Israeli soldiers fighting there.
It was very, very emotional. And then they brought it back here, and this is where it stays in the meantime. It's on loan to us. And when we go back to Netzarim, and we have our synagogue there, we're going to put this back in the place that it came from.
Franklin and others here tell me living in Gaza or Gush Katif is not only about security, but something that God has promised to the Jewish people. They see things like this, a replica of a mosaic believed to be from the floor of a Gazan synagogue dating back to the Byzantine era, as proof that their roots run deep there.
It's our connection, it's our bond to the place. You see, the fact, look, we have, for me, the fact that we have a bond to the place, a connection to the place, that means a lot. You know, that it's mine.
Journalist Noga Tarnopolsky says the campaign for a return to Gaza is not what most Israelis are concerned with in the aftermath of October 7th.
It is part of a very dangerous thing we're seeing, which is this chasm between what average Israeli citizens want and need and are scared of or are demanding, and what their government is actually doing.
The U.S. has repeatedly said it opposes any Israeli reoccupation of Gaza. In his January 2024 visit to Israel, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said this on notions of Palestinian displacement.
Palestinian civilians must be able to return home as soon as conditions allow. They must not be pressed to leave Gaza.
Blinken said that genuine security for Israel requires a two-state solution, meaning a Palestinian state alongside Israel. That two-state solution is something Netanyahu has repeatedly rejected, something he and Daniella Weiss agree on. Her work now focuses on creating so-called outposts. These are settlements which even the Israeli government considers illegal in the occupied West Bank, creating facts on the ground which many in the international community say should form the core of any future Palestinian state.
I'm so glad I'm not Blinken, because what he says is not smart. There is no chance whatsoever for a two-state solution. It seems that he takes some paper and reads, and someone forgot to tell him in the administration that it's not relevant. And he keeps reading from it. He reiterates, in my eyes, in an embarrassing manner. We have now 800,000 Jews living in 250 settlements in Judea and Samaria. Where will you put, Mr. Blinken, where will you put your two-state solution? Where are you going to do it?
In the West Bank, settlers have often gotten government recognition for settlements they built illegally after the fact. It's not government policy to allow settlements in Gaza, but Weiss says she may not wait and may take a similar approach there.
What we are going to do, I'm telling you secretly, we are going to squat close to the border. Right now, there is a border that prevents us from entering. But maybe the northern part of Gaza, which is actually not under any formal sovereignty, it's called the no man's land. So maybe over there, it will be easier. So once we start, then once there is an opening, then there will be the second stage and the third stage. It will happen in my lifetime.
Okay, this prime minister has a track record of giving these extremists things that nobody ever dreamed them or anyone even in their position, in their office would have. Then why is it unrealistic or why should we not take their demands to reoccupy Gaza seriously? Because it seems that they have a very good track record of getting things done in this country.
So that's a very good question, and the answer is a bit complex. But it's a really good question, so I want us to address it. You mentioned Netanyahu's track record, and what you're mentioning is a recent track record. Netanyahu's been prime minister for 15, 16 years, and his actual track record is one of stasis. Netanyahu has been the guy who just tried to keep the status quo and say, I'm the hero, for many of these years. He's not himself particularly radical. He's himself very self-interested. He wants to preserve his own power, and for many years, the best way he saw to preserve power was simply, let's keep everything on a kind of low heat. Everything will be okay. What changed everything is that in 2019, he was indicted for very serious crimes of corruption. And all of a sudden, he began to perceive the state, the institutions of state, the police that investigated him, the judiciary that indicted him and that was putting him on trial, he began to perceive them as his enemies. This is the event that radicalized Netanyahu. First of all, against the institutions of state, and secondly, politically, because the entire center of the Israeli political arena took a step back from him, didn't want to sit in government with an indicted criminal. So he ended up becoming more and more dependent on these marginal figures, many of whom themselves are criminals, convicted criminals. They didn't care if he's a crook or an indicted crook. So he was radicalized on various levels. So his track record, in fact, during the last year is extremely radical. He returned to power December 29th, 2022, and his first step was to attempt what he called a judicial reform, which in fact was what in Spanish we call an autogolpe. He attempted to take power of state. And had he succeeded, he would have had unfettered power. And the questions that you ask would have been terrifying questions, because had he succeeded, he would have probably tried to issue orders that today remain illegal orders, but it's unclear whether they would be still illegal. And I think it's important to mention Netanyahu's attempted coup provoked massive protests in Israel, massive. Millions of people protesting in a country of just 10 million. Israelis are very aware of the limits of the power of their prime minister. So that what really radicalized the Israeli public was in late March 2023, the defense minister made a statement, a warning that he's obliged under the law to make as Minister of Defense. And he said that if the government continued to pursue this judicial reform, it was endangering national security. Netanyahu responded by firing him on the spot with immediate effect. This sent, I think, 500,000 Israelis to the street that night. Why, you may ask? Because Israelis know that if they don't have a defense minister who's independent, that is the first step towards an authoritarian takeover. Israelis were scared to death. And Netanyahu was forced, basically by public opposition, to undo that firing. And the reason I can have this conversation with you today and say, Netanyahu never says no to these two radical ministers, but de facto he can't really give them what they want, is because the Israeli people stood up and stopped him. And that is a remarkable thing.